Hello, everyone. I am Behruz Qamari Tabrizi. I'm the director of Sharmin and Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. Before we begin our conversation today, I would like to extend my thanks to our events coordinator, Becky Parnian, and Pete Novak, who supports the IT related issues. And both of them has made this series so easily accessible and very pleasant for us to manage. Before we start our conversation, let me go over some logistics. Our guests, our author will speak for around 15 minutes at the beginning, and then discussants would comment for 10 minutes or so, after which we have a short conversation before opening the screen for questions from our audience. You can submit your questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I would read and pose your questions to our guests. This was an event in the making for a long time, and I'm so looking forward to be a part of this conversation today. Professor Natasha Iskander is Associate Professor of Urban Planning and Public Service at NYU. In her work, she addresses the relationship between migration and economic development. She examines the ways that immigration and the movement of people across borders can provide the basis for the creation of new knowledge and new pathways for political change. She has published widely on these questions. Professor Iskander is the author of Creative State, 40 Years of Migration and Development Policy in Morocco and Mexico, which came out in 2010. The book looks at the ways that migrant workers transformed the economic development policies of their countries of origin. And the book we'll be discussing today, we present the book, this beautiful book, Does Skill make us human? Migrant workers in 21st century Qatar and beyond, which was published just a few months ago by Princeton University Press. Professor Iskander received her PhD in management from MIT, and from where she also has a master's degree in city planning. In addition to her research, she engages in development work with partners ranging from the World Bank to small NGOs internationally and in the United States on the issues of urban development, migration, and development policies and migrant workers' rights. Joining us also today in conversation with Natasha is Professor Andrew Ross, a social activist, a professor of social and cultural analysis department at NYU, a contributor to the Guardian, the New York Times, Nation, Art Forum, Jacobin, London Review of Books, and Al Jazeera. He's the author and editor of 25 books, which I'm not going to go through all the titles, and more than 250 articles on a variety of topics: labor, work, urbanism, politics, technology, environmental justice, and so on and so forth. He's the author of, most recently, Sunbelt Blues, The Failure of American Housing, and Stone Men, The Palestinians Who Built Israel, which was the winner of Palestinian Book Award. In several of his books, Professor Ross has pioneered a method he calls scholarly reporting, which is a blend of investigative journalism and ethnography. In his recently published book, Under Conditions not of our choosing, it reflects on the challenges of combining activism with writing and scholarship. Since we are discussing the building of venues for World Cup in Qatar, which is this is the World Soccer Games, football games, as other rest of the world calls it. I think I'm at liberty to disclose that Andrew is an avid supporter of Liverpool, and I can also go Liverpool, and also I can share that Iran also qualified for the World Cup a couple of weeks ago. So both Andrew and I have invested interest in what will be going on in these stadiums, but that's the lighter side. But the real story is going to be told by Natasha. Thank you so much for agreeing to participate in this, both of you. And we'll start with Natasha, and then we'll have the conversation from there. The screen is yours. Yes.
Thank you so much, Behruz, for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here. I want to also thank Andrew for agreeing to be a discussant. It's a real privilege. And I really want to say that I learned so much from Andrew's book, Stone Men. So if you haven't picked it up, I mean, all of his books are amazing, but that particular book really I found to be incredibly rich and incredibly compassionate, in addition to its like analytic insight. So I encourage all of you to pick up a copy and read it. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So just give me a second to manage the technical part of this. I'm hoping that everyone can see this. So today I am talking about Does Skill Make Us Human? Migrant Workers in 21st Century Qatar and Beyond. And this book asks, does skill make us human? And it unpacks that question. But it also asks, is skill another word for freedom? It asks, what are the political consequences of defining some people as skilled and some people as unskilled? And this book explores these questions by looking at the experience of migrant workers in Qatar's booming construction industry as it prepares to host the 2022 World Cup for football. I started this project in Qatar after it was awarded the FIFA hosting rights in 2010. And immediately after it was awarded these hosting rights, Qatar began the massive construction required for the games, funneling literally hundreds of billions of dollars to reinvent itself as a global destination for sports and culture. Alongside the stadia, which have gotten a lot of attention, and hotels and infrastructure, Qatar also built a number of stunning cultural and educational buildings. And I wanted to take you inside one of these buildings that I find particularly beautiful. The Qatar Faculty for Islamic Studies sits now on the edge of Education City. This is a complex of overseas campuses. The QFIS building contains a faculty and a mosque, and it's designed as a three-dimensional illustration of Islamic calligraphy. The design of the building is meant to capture the relationship between knowledge and faith, and it was designed by the Spanish architectural firm Manguera y Vares. This is the inside of the mosque, the prayer space, and it's illuminated by hundreds of tiny lights. This is the brilliance of the stars on desert nights. But throughout the building, you have the creation of the gardens of heaven, gardens of paradise throughout the building. There are internal waterfalls, beautiful spaces, and the building is covered with calligraphy of all time periods. What is interesting about this is that the design manages the light flow in the building to ensure that the calligraphy does not cast a shadow that a believer might inadvertently step on. The building was a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. Pieces were fitted together with joints so that the building could actually move in response to the desert winds. And in particular, I want to draw your attention to the minarets, which are designed to look like beams of light. They rise 80 meters above the ground, but they're cantilevered at an incline of 25 degrees, which means that their stability is a little bit more fragile. And so there are hydraulic devices at the base to allow the beams to sway with the wind. This is an extremely technically complex building, in addition to its stunning beauty. It is a highly sophisticated engineering design. Like many of the buildings in Qatar, it's an unprecedented feat of engineering and architectural innovation. The building is organized around steel rib cages, which allow the building to move and breathe. It was extremely difficult to build. It required an enormous amount of precision work. The cladding, for example, every joint on the building had to line up perfectly so that the calligraphy could line up perfectly, but also so that the building could move as designed. And I want to just take a moment to draw your attention to the scaffolding. To build this building, you had to actually construct a scaffolding shell all around to accommodate this detail installation, the detailed cladding, the detailed welding work. But the most dramatic accomplishment in terms of scaffolding here was the construction of the scaffolds for the minarets. These were freestanding scaffolds of 85 meters, 26 stories high. They are the largest and most, they don't exist anymore, but the largest and most elaborate scaffolding structure ever attempted anywhere in the world. And it's a living structure. Scaffolding comes up, it goes down, it moves around. To construct this scaffold and to make sure that it was actually able to be freestanding and not fall under its own weight in the desert conditions, hundreds of workers hauled up the material to build the structure manually. They climbed up dozens of stories, up ladders, temporary stairs. They hauled up pipes, joints, planks, swivels, gravlocks, clamps. All told, each worker handled 1 ton of material every day. They handled it with precision and handled it wordlessly because it's very loud up there because of construction noises and wind and other things. And they assembled and interpreted drawings to assemble the scaffolding as the building process progressed. Okay, I just want to draw your attention here to the internal scaffold. Not only was there an external scaffold, there was an internal scaffold. And here, what I'd like to draw your attention to is this particular area, which is how the scaffold progressed laterally to the inside of the building. This is what this looks like up close. The scaffolders here describe themselves as the men who hang from the sky. And in fact, they did. They did so very skillfully. Not one fall, no injuries from falling equipment, with workers working just underneath, and not one failure of the structure. The men who hung from the sky and worked in other trades were recruited from all over the world. The QFIS site, like most large sites, was about 10,000 men. With 20 languages spoken. The construction industry in Qatar is entirely migrant, and the firms that operate there are also international. But the migrants who arrived with minimal construction experience, if any. So the companies on site had to invest heavily in training their workforces. Every aspect of every process on the project site was designed to promote on-the-job learning. They built something that even the engineers on site were not sure that they were going to be able to pull off. And they developed new skills to do so because these were new innovative feats of engineering. And so as a result, the construction sites in Qatar functioned as vast training systems through which hundreds of thousands of men or thousands of men on a given site developed specialized construction skills. Companies designed highly detailed and highly proprietary systems to measure and develop worker skills. Every single process on site doubled as an on-the-job training system. This is because companies actually lived and died based on how well they were able to train their workers. Their ability to implement these fantastical designs depended on these training systems. And yet, when I asked the managers and supervisors at projects like QFIS about their workers, they all described them as unskilled. They described their master scaffolders, their expert welders, their precision cladders as unproductive, poor quality, and sometimes just bodies. And this knowing that they measured the worker skill development often several times a day. And this, I want to point out, is view shared implicitly and perhaps unintentionally by much of the press coverage and human rights analysis of Qatar. There's a representation of these workers as unskilled. Nevertheless, these reportings and studies of conditions in Qatar documented an array of labor abuses, from wage theft to abysmal living conditions in labor camps to rates of injury and death that are shocking. And these reports focused on violations of basic bodily welfare, exploitation of workers' bodies in their reporting. Much of the coverage of the conditions in Qatar attributed the extreme violations to the kafala or sponsorship system. This is kafala in Arabic. For most of the decades after the hosting rights were awarded, the kafala system formally bound migrant workers to their employers. The employer was the sponsor or kafil and was legally responsible and legally empowered over workers. Employers could deport workers and control their movements for any reason, and workers were not able to withhold their labor for any reason at all, including non-payment of wages, sometimes extended, abuse, unsafe conditions. They could not change employers, they could not quit, and they also could not leave the country without their employer's permission. These rules have changed, but changed recently. There have been some modest amendments. But the thing that was interesting for me in looking at these rules was that all the foreign workers in Qatar were covered by the same rules, regardless of wage, occupation, national origin. And professionals, people like doctors, lawyers, executives, hotel managers, nurses, they were not experiencing these labor violations. So if they were all covered by the same regulatory structure, what was producing the kind of exploitation that construction workers faced? And to understand what was producing the conditions in Qatar, I conducted research in 5 countries and 8 languages. I interviewed a broad array of actors, government, industry leaders, workers, and I spent hundreds of hours on Qatari construction sites shadowing workers. The research happened in layers. I'm going to skip here over how it was conducted in layers, but I'm happy to come back to this in the Q&A if you're interested. Through this research, it became clear to me that skill was being used to reference something other than ability. Managers and supervisors were not referring to ability, but rather they were referring to a political category. Unskilled, in quotation marks, was a subordinate political status. The migrants who were slotted in that category were dehumanized and were described as not having the full capacity for freedom. And so their exploitation was made to seem inconsequential and to some extent unavoidable. The reason this was possible is that in denying skill, employers were in effect denying learning and the very learning that they were promoting on their sites. They were denying that learning was happening. And the reason that this is important is that learning is fundamentally an act of freedom. You can compel someone to do something. You can force them to act in a certain way, but you can't force someone to learn. Learning is an intimate process. It requires imagination, connection, trust, desire, and fundamentally it requires volition. So in denying learning, this was a way to deny that workers had the capacity for these human registers. And if you're human registers that are part of the expression of freedom. And so if you are denying that workers had the capacity for these registers, you are denying also their capacity for freedom. And then from there, it's very easy to deprive workers who are denied that they have the capacity for freedom of rights and dignity that the claim was they didn't have the capacity for to begin with. So the argument about skill I'm making is not about bias and assessment, but rather it's about the political consequences of being unskilled. And ultimately the label unskilled was used to cast doubt on the full personhood of workers. and to call into question their capacity for, and therefore their right to freedom. This is the role of language as a political language to deny freedom, to deny full political personhood, is definitely true in Qatar, and I look at it in Qatar, but it manifests in economies all around the world. As I began examining skill not as a measure of ability, but rather as a political category, it became clear to me that the politics of skill shaped all aspects of social and political life in Qatar. The book examines these one by one, but today I just want to take a quick dip into the politics of skill and heat injury. Last year, The Guardian published an analysis that indicated that 6,500 workers from Qatar, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka had died in Qatar since it was awarded the hosting rights. So a rate of 12 a week. And this analysis doesn't include workers from other sending countries. Qatar challenged this number, and shockingly, just this past month, the FIFA president Infantino claimed in a speech to the EU that only 3 workers had died building World Cup facilities. The debate about the number of deaths and what counts as an occupational fatality versus a death from natural causes has raged since the very beginning of Qatar being awarded world hosting rights. And it has raged in the international press around the world. But based on my observation of construction sites in Qatar, this is maybe not the right question. The question for me is, why have not more workers died? Part of the difficulty in resolving the debate around how many workers have died is that there's a lot of controversy around what counts as an occupational injury. Do worker deaths count only when workers have died on site from a work-related accident? Much of the fatalities that have been reported have been, quote unquote, of natural causes, the result of disease. You can see this here in this graph. But heat here is what melts the distinction between occupational fatalities and occupational injury in Qatar. Workers described in their conversations with me when I asked them what was the most difficult part of their jobs in Qatar, they described heat as being the most difficult part. They described it as a sensation of drowning with the air melting, the sky pressing down on them. They described the heat as absolutely unimaginable until they had encountered it in Qatar. And here you see workers' faces protected against the sun. So Qatar is hot, but it's also the fastest warming place on the planet due to quirks of geography and climate change. You can see this in this graph. You'll notice here that the temperatures are not in straight temperatures, but in something called the wet bulb globe temperature, which is a composite of ambient and radiative temperature, humidity in the air, and wind shear, and it's designed to capture the effect of heat on the body. And you can see the dramatic rise in the wet bulb globe temperature. So heat is dangerous, and this metric, the wet bulb, was designed to indicate how dangerous. It was developed by the US military in the 1950s to map out what kind of activity is safe at different levels of heat exposure. Okay, so let me just take you back here. So, right, like at this square, right, or this rectangle right here, which is between 30.5 and 31.5 degrees centigrade in WGTH, you would only be allowed to do 15 minutes of moderate work, which is like the equivalent of walking, maybe walking uphill, and a need to drink 1 cup of water every 15 minutes. The other 45 minutes of this hour would require you to be resting. Above 35.5, no heat is possible. Just being outside is actually a threat to your life. Okay, this is the line. These are the average monthly temperatures in WGTH in Qatar between 1981 and 2020. So this includes kind of the rise. So it's a conservative estimate. And this is the line at which 15 hours of work per hour with adequate hydration is allowed. You can see here that for most of April, all the way through the end of September, no one should be working in Qatar. Okay, this is the month of July in Qatar this past year. This is the line that indicates where work is life-threatening for a body at rest and where people should be indoors. You can see here that in 2020, actually starting really in 2005, no one should be out in Qatar at all. Okay, recently Qatar passed new regulation that allowed for a new safety line prohibiting work at 32.1 centigrade. This is a regulation approved by the ILO and celebrated by the ILO. And let us recall that that line lives in the box that is deadly. Okay, so let me just very quickly tell you a little bit about heat. Heat injury is very complex, and it's an attack on the neurocognitive system first. It attacks cognition, motor abilities, emotional regulation, and spatial perception, so that if you have the beginnings of heat stroke, you are confused, you can't move your body, and you're upset. And these aleatory symptoms, which seem kind of fuzzy and not clear, actually indicate internal damage to organs that are progressively severe. The damage is short-term in the moment, but over time it is long-term and can create chronic and severe damage, so much so that in Nepal, for example, in response to workers working in Qatar, many hospitals have opened nephrotic wings to deal with chronic kidney failure. And the effects are unpredictable. So you can be fine in the heat one day, and then the next day you can actually find that your life is threatened. And it's same conditions, sometimes even better conditions, and yet it just is, the effects are really dramatic. How do companies manage heat? What they do is really performative. In April, May, they offer heat induction training where they go over in a 30-minute PowerPoint rest cycles, hydration, signs of heat stress, and how you respond to emergency situations, dramatic heat stroke in the moment. And supervisors get these checklists to check have they actually followed up and made sure that there is water and people can hydrate, etc. This is what this actually looks like in practice. Here you see an empty drinking water station, very common. So drinking 4 cups of water an hour seems complicated. Even if you could do that, part of the problem is that the lines to the bathroom, so 1 bathroom, 2 bathrooms for thousands of men, meant that workers had to stand in the sun for 15, 20 minutes. So in fact, workers avoided drinking so that they wouldn't have to stand in the sun. Other factors, this is a cooling room. You can see here kind of the mind games like work safely, otherwise if you die, you have betrayed your family. This is me. And you can see here that no one is in here. I mean, there are very few workers in here on a very hot day because the penalties, informal penalties with the extremely rapid timelines of construction for actually taking a break are very high for workers, so they don't take breaks. Okay, I'm almost done. I know we're running close to the edge of my time, and my office light will go off, but I will still be visible to you. But we're not set up for Zoom. So how did workers deal with heat? And the most important feature here is that workers developed really intensive relations of care to help one another manage and cope with the heat and to care for one another when heat symptoms started to emerge. So this is a picture of a scaffolding structure that's moving toward the inside of this stadium. And one of the things that I hope to illustrate with this picture is that workers are interdependent. So if one worker is dizzy, uncoordinated, et cetera, it has safety impacts for everyone around. So workers were very attentive to how workers, their colleagues were doing. And they took care to provide early attention to their colleagues on site, sitting workers down, giving them water, resting, taking over their workload. They did this on and off site. So if someone had had difficulty during the day because of heat, their colleagues at the labor camp would make sure that they were well hydrated, would trade places with them to give them a bed in the best air-conditioned room, and would make sure that they had a good dinner. And in addition to that, workers developed heat-resistant construction technologies. So one of the things that the scaffolders did, for example, was to develop techniques so that they could minimize their bodily movements while doing the same work in a really subtle and really dramatic way. Okay, so how does this relate to skill politics? The argument that I want to suggest here is that skill politics magnify the dangers of heat. And here I'm coming to a close to tell you that skill politics give employers the power to injure, and the power to injure becomes a disciplinary mechanism. So the political logic here, framed by this skill politics, is that workers are provided with safety training. If they are injured, it means they are not using the safety training. And not that they don't have water, not that they are rushed, not that they are working with forced overtime, not that they are exposed to conditions that are life-threatening at rest. It means that the training is not used. And the workers who do not use the training chose not to use the training or did not have the capacity to use the training. So they chose or did not have the capacity to learn. So this is a confirmation of the fact that workers described as unskilled don't have the capacity to learn and ultimately don't have the capacity for freedom. And this becomes the power to injure, because this means that workers, this rhetoric allows managers to subject workers to conditions that management itself has acknowledged are hazardous. And workers are prevented from protecting themselves. So this, drawing your recall back to the image of the family, Papa is waiting for you, right? So they are prevented from protecting themselves, the kind of power involved in we will subject you to injury and you will know that we are subjecting you to injury that is unnecessary. And this is, I think, the most profound expression of the denial of personhood and humanity. It is a profound message that you are incredibly disposable. You don't count as a full person. And with that, I will end it. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Natasha. Let's move on to Andrew and have that short conversation later between the two of you. Andrew.
Yeah, thank you, Natasha. That was really riveting. You've written not just a great work of scholarship, but you've also done us a great service by giving us this account of the Gulf's migrant worker economy at a time when these workers are very much in the public eye, of course, with the World Cup looming and accusations of sports washing circulating quite widely in the media. I suspect the media scrutiny of worker conditions will subside somewhat in the immediate lead up to the tournament. And so I think the release of this book right now is impeccable timing. At NYU, at least, where we have a long-standing campus debate about the conditions of migrant workers in Abu Dhabi, an account of our campus there, I can report that this book has already elevated and redefined the tenor of that debate. There's just so many things to appreciate about it. But I guess my primary insight is that it's very rare to actually see anyone turn detailed fieldwork into a serious philosophical treatise. But in many ways, that's what the book offers. Ultimately, in this case, is a treatise in skill. And it's quite a Socratic one at that, because throughout the book, as Behrooz mentioned at the beginning, you return again and again to asking this question that is summarized in the title. And you end up with some very paradigm-shaking answers to the question, does skill make us human? About how the designation of unskilled status systematically denies freedom and personhood to workers, just as much as their immigration status might do. I also sincerely hope that the book is read by folks in labor studies, because it's a major contribution to the field, especially to labor process theory. This is a subfield that Harry Braverman launched with his book, Monopoly and Labor and Monopoly Capital, 1974. And Braverman's is a story about the capitalist de-skilling of artisanal work through the introduction of factory technology and the industrial division of labor and so on and so forth. And what Natasha's book does is it reminds us in a very sober way that some industries never really fit that pattern, especially the labor-intensive trades like construction that are central to her study. And some of the most insightful portions of the book are about how workers under the division of labor and Qatari sites, how workers are required to skill up or reskill themselves on the job by performing these very complex construction feats in a myriad of creative and life-affirming ways. Arguably, the outcome is no less coercive, not to mention dangerous, but it's also a departure, theoretically, at least, from standard labor process theory. And from the point of view of area studies, the book, I think, gives us the very deepest understanding to date of the much maligned kafala sponsorship system. Natasha describes its historical roots in the pearling trade, its evolution in the oil and construction industries, and its tenacious survival today. Since I think it's fair to say newspaper reports about the death of Qatar's kafala system have proven to be premature. Best of all, the book effectively debunks the public myth that kafala is some kind of illiberal Arab institution that is somehow uniquely oppressive on the global landscape. On the contrary, she shows us how specific it is to the colonial history of the region, and also how, very importantly, how in each successive era it has been very heavily dependent on worker recruitment debt, which is to say that debt is employed both as a weapon of labor discipline and also as a source of profit for labor brokers. We also learned that the division of labor recruitment between skilled and unskilled was originally a product of British imperial policy, even as the evolving kafala system has maintained and exploited it. Most visceral of all, and today you've given us a taste of it, Natasha, your detailed description of how people work in 40-degree heat, what happens to bodies, including your own. The chapter in the book is quite gruesome and goes into great detail about the impact on the body. And I promise you it will challenge your sense of the limits of humane labor. And as you point out, the Gulf region is already facing down potentially severe impacts of climate change. And so the extremity of these work conditions should bring home to us how the comfort zone for human subsistence, not just work, but human subsistence on the planet is rapidly diminishing. Let me just mention one last insight. It's again related to climate change, which to me arguably was the most original discovery in your field work. And that involves the deliberate decision on the part of man-powered companies to recruit workers from climate damaged regions of the world. That is where newly poor workers can be found, who are desperate for income, but who have benefited, at least until recently, from high levels of education and other services that are now being drained away from a population in a location with no future, because it's a natural sacrifice zone. From the perspective of labor recruiters, these are the ideal workers, cheap and willing, but also literate and therefore capable of taking on these skilled tasks on site. And so, as you point out, this is a recruitment practice where ecological damage becomes a business resource, and drawing attention to it, as you have done in the book, potentially changes how we talk about climate migrants or climate refugees. And this strikes me as a very important insight to take on board as we face the future of ever-increasing migration streams and degradation in these labor-sending regions. I have a couple of questions for you, which we can discuss or not. But the first one, I would say that no one attending this webinar will doubt that it must have been very difficult to do this research, to say the least. GCC countries are notoriously intolerant when it comes to outsiders poking their nose into labor conditions. And in fact, the consensus among scholars is that it is dangerous to do so. So I'm wondering if you can tell us about some of the obstacles that you encountered. My second question is a little more speculative. Under the kafala system, it makes no sense to talk about a labor market. And so most of the reform efforts are aimed at bringing into being a conventional capitalist labor market, one in which, you know, workers are free of recruitment debt and ties to their sponsors. They're able to own their own skills, and they're able to trade their labor openly and freely to a variety of employers, subject to effective regulations. The implementation of these reforms would still need to be effectively monitored, however, which is a huge challenge in an authoritarian society. And so more ideally, labor advocates point to instead a significant level of worker empowerment should be the goal, because workers ultimately are the ones who can, you know, verify abuse of their labor. And if they're members of a trade union, they can win collective power in the workplace. So my question is, where do skills come into that? The historical record shows us that workers who reclaim ownership of their skills from the employer and who try to bargain on the basis of these skills tend to turn towards exclusive forms of self-protection and self-advancement. Marx referred to this as the aristocracy of labor, and is often an obstacle to broader and more inclusive versions of sisterhood and brotherhood. And so my question really is, how would the return of ownership over skills in a place like Qatar be any different? And it's again, it's a speculative question, but in some ways your book points in that direction, even if it doesn't explicitly go there. So I think it's a fair question to ask. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Andrew. This was truly thought-provoking questions. And before Natasha, you respond to those questions, I want to tag on to the first question, because I mean, you bring that question in the postscript, and since many of our graduate students, I mean, we are in the Center of Iran and Persian Gulf Studies, and then Department of Near Eastern Studies, and it would be really good. I thought that the postscript is your next book. You know, it's just like it's so fun. I was so glad to see that coming at the end, and because it's very helpful for any scholar to know how actually do you do research, scholarly work under perilous conditions, and if you could elaborate a little bit on that, because that's part of the first question Andrew asked, and then the second question you can talk about after that. Thank you.
Thanks so much for these questions. They're really great. So I want to concur here with the workers that the most difficult part of this field work was the heat. The most difficult and most dangerous part of this field work was the heat. And I had the ability to protect myself far more than the workers did. So I didn't conduct field work in the middle hours of the day. And I didn't conduct field work over the summer on construction sites. Because the heat conditions were life-threatening, and any kind of on-site field work where I was actually shadowing workers meant stepping out of the air-conditioned managers' trailers and into this incredible heat and doing the physical activity of climbing scaffolds and other things. And it is hard to imagine how difficult the heat is. It really is like a person in a story. It's a character. It's a protagonist. It's everything in some ways. It's just like a wall of just fire. That's what it feels like. And to have to work and remain sentient and have control of your body and all of this stuff during while you're facing this heat is pretty significant and was very dangerous and difficult to manage. So I'll say that was the most difficult piece. The other pieces about access and the sensitivity of the work. Sometimes I get asked about the gender dynamics. All of that, I would say, are like the rest of the book in that Qatar might be a more extreme example, but it is not a unique example. So increasingly what we find around the world is that people who study areas that are securitized around migration and work are increasingly confronting the sharp edge of the surveillance state, whether that is on the US-Mexico border, whether it's in the Mediterranean, or whether it's in the GCC. And one of the reasons I decided to write the postscript, which is unusual, it's not something that's usually included in these sorts of books, we maintain this illusion of somehow being, even though we have decades now of scholarship on the positionality of the researcher, somehow we just don't end up talking about this. And in fact, when I was trying to construct the postscript, I found very little literature on what it's like to conduct research in authoritarian regimes as a subjective experience, but also what it means for your research and what it means about what you can see, what you can't see, and what constitutes data. And for me, I think it's actually really important to start having those discussions because ultimately we are able to see what we are allowed to see on some level. And the places where our vision is obscured are also data, right? So that's why I think it's important to write the postscript and to identify the positionality of the researcher also in a vulnerable position. The other thing that I think I wanted to accomplish with the postscript is to suggest that field sites change. They change over time. They change over the course of your fieldwork. So when I started this project, there was a little bit of a moment of aperture, maybe some naivete, maybe the Qatari government in some ways was growing into its capacity as a security state. The UAE, for example, is much more sophisticated, as Andrew knows. So there was a moment of aperture there. I was very careful to manage the perceptions around this. I was careful to get funding from the Qatari government, to get the seal of approval from people in the royal family, to really just signal what I was doing and to be absolutely transparent about it. And then things changed. The field kind of shifted under me. And what is difficult, I think, about those moments of political shift is that it's unclear how things will end up. And it's unclear even to the actors who are changing the political environment. And so there is a lot of a kind of arbitrariness, and the arbitrariness is exceptionally difficult to manage. And the arbitrariness is not just about the power plays at the top, but it's also, is the surveillance the result of the zeal of a bureaucrat, in kind of middle management of the security state? Or is it something from above? Or is it a random error? Or, right, like these things make it exceptionally difficult to manage. And so for me, what was important was to be very careful every step of the way. So to document, for example, my compliance with human subjects protocol in ways that seem kind of ridiculous, maybe on their face, and seemed kind of excessive, but were very important ultimately to protecting my professional status, to take lots of measures to protect my safety, but more importantly, the safety of my research team, to be really careful. And this meant kind of training the research team in things that seemed excessive, like what things not to send over email, how to make sure that you're absolutely protecting confidentiality, what you're posting on social media, right? To absolutely protect the confidentiality of workers and anyone actually who had been part of the project. And then the final piece is that the only way I think to be successful in this kind of project is to recognize that governments are complex, governments and industries are complex fields, and that there is no kind of evil actor. They're all complex, and there are ways to find solidarity, alliance, support in even the most repressive settings. And I found, for example, that some of the most important gestures of help and some of the most important gestures of support for this research and for workers came from people in Qatari people and organizations that were characterized as incredibly oppressive. So I think really it's important to be nuanced about the political landscape that you're operating in. Having said that, this was a very stressful project, very stressful.
Just to put it lightly. You know?
Yeah. But I learned so much, and it was just just being in these relations of care amongst the workers was a really fantastic thing. They took care of me when I got heat stroke. I mean, it was just there is a level here of kind of care and pride and work that it was really so important and more than uplifting, like heart-filling to see. I want to just flag one thing about the heat and to point to Andrew's point here about Qatar being somehow unique as a very quickly warming area and maybe a harbinger of what is coming. The Qatari heat standard, which as I pointed out is, you know, smack in the middle of life-threatening, was supported and developed in conjunction with the ILO. So here is the labor organization, right, that is now setting a heat standard. Most countries don't have a heat standard. The US does not have a heat standard. This will be the standard of what is considered safe now. It is, to my mind, unconscionable. Okay, so that's the thing about Qatar being a harbinger. It's not just what we see, but what is happening there. And these global conversations about labor rights will have ramifications far beyond Qatar. To the second point, the speculative point that Andrew asks me to consider, I will say one thing that is not so speculative, and then one thing that is speculative. The not so speculative thing is that Qatar is very far away from having a labor market, and that no regulatory change in kind of employment relations, even if it actually was functional, and it's not actually functional, but let's say it actually was implemented, it still would be far from being a labor market. Why? Because labor markets exist in social context. And the social context in Qatar is one where workers cannot move through space in any way unencumbered. So the idea that you can somehow go find another job is just ludicrous on its face. Like, you can't actually move through space to go from one employer to another. There's no way to find out about another. What's happening with these regulations is that companies who are bidding for another project hire their workers as if they were another employer. And so they don't have to go through some of the regulatory structures. But you would have to actually change the context. You would have to change the reasons people migrate and how they migrate. So I think it points to the fact that in the discourse around labor markets and then the celebratory discourse around the reforms, it's kind of this ideal that the market functions. It's this magical thing. And it's not. It's an institutional structure that is deeply contextualized. Okay, so on to the aristocracy of labor question. I think for that to be a concern, you would need to have a labor market where people could actually move. And I think that one of the interesting things about Qatar, so I'm dodging your question a little bit, but one of the interesting things about Qatar is that the skill development processes on site, the teaching and learning actually became a vehicle for workers to develop solidarities across skill level and across nationality. So that, for example, you had these kind of fictive kinship structures where a more experienced worker would become the uncle or the big brother, training the little brother or the son. And these fictive networks were more than just about work. They were really about kind of human compassion, solidarity, friendship. And they crossed nationality, they crossed language in ways that were really uncomfortable for the Qatari government and for employers. And I think that that is actually maybe the beginnings of a model that isn't based on the aristocracy of labor, right? Like, I don't know how things will develop in Qatar, but I think it's inspiring to think about teaching and learning as a way to build solidarity. So I think, do you feel satisfied, Andrew?
That's fantastic. Let me, we are reaching the end of the hour, but I want to read a couple of, post a couple of questions from our audience. One is in relation to the immigration status, because you talked about kafala system and how that system is linked to the immigration status. And the other question, if you could address both of them in one response, was there any intervention from Qatari or other civil society organizations prior to awarding the World Cup to Qatar to sort of bring the question of labor protection as part of this award to Qatar, and how did that play out?
So the first question about the legal status, they're certainly undocumented, out of status workers in Qatar, but they're very, very, very small minority. Like, you know, I don't know in percentage points exactly, but tiny. And everyone is, you know, the 95% of the labor force is actually under this reformed kafala system now, with some distinctions actually based on skill, such that kind of essential workers at higher, and again in quotation marks, skill levels are don't have the same freedoms of movement. And I think this is actually a reference to the fact that they are not bound by the social structures that keep them tied to their workforce. So you actually have to maintain a kind of a legal structure to tie them to their workplace. But really the out of status workers are so imperiled. It's just incredibly dangerous to be an undocumented worker in Qatar, and it's incredibly difficult to manage your life. Housing is attached to employment for anyone who is not a very elite worker. So all of that, it just makes it very difficult to be an undocumented worker in Qatar, and it's just a minuscule fraction. And then about whether there was labor activism prior to the World Cup hosting award, I would say that, you know, a kind of a blunt answer to that would be no. And I think, you know, I think the labor activism that came as a result of the World Cup was to some extent shocking and surprising to Qataris and to the Qatari government. That it was kind of confounding, like, what is the issue here? And I think that speaks to the power of political narrative. Like, why would these questions of forced overtime or non-payment of wages or dangerous conditions or, you know, abysmal, dehumanizing labor living conditions, why would that be an issue? Like, you know, one person that I spoke to said, you know, this was like several years after the press coverage, right? I don't understand what the big fuss is about. If you go to see how these workers live in their home countries, it's even dirtier than here. So, right, like I think that points to a larger narrative that still comes up, that this is an opportunity for workers. And so why is it that there are complaints about Qatar's treatment of workers? And I think that there's a piece here where somehow it's like the political impact of the political disempowerment that comes with being poor, and related to it, how poverty is assumed somehow to not give you rights to full personhood and full dignity.
Thank you so much. This is, I mean, of course, we can go on and on about the book, and truly, I mean, we can have another session talking about the conceptual interventions that you're making here, and hopefully one of these days we can have both of you in person in Princeton. I know that Andrew is not a big fan of coming to Princeton, but we'll persuade him to come down to Princeton and have a broader conversation about, you know, labor, what makes us human, and labor in the Gulf, continue this conversation. Again, thank you so much. This was so brilliant. What a wonderful conversation. Thank you to both of you, Andrew and Natasha.
Thank you so much for having us, and thank you for the wonderful comments and the excellent questions. Thank you.
Thank you. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.